Hello, everyone. Welcome to the American Museum of Fly Fishing. This is another edition of Tackle Talk. I'm your host, Curator Jim Schottenham, and I'm joined today by author and tackle historian Steve Woit, who has written a wonderful book on the fly panels put together by Mary Orvis Marbury. I'd also like to welcome all of our viewers from midcurrent.com. And if you're new to the webinar series here at the museum, since March of 2025, we have been counting down the top 50 objects in the museum's collection. And it was announced yesterday on midcurrent.com that our number one artifact here in the museum is, in fact, the panels put together by Mary Orvis Marbury for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And of course, we're here today with Steve Woit. Steve, thank you for coming in today. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming in. So the panels, of course, are, good at that there. The panels, of course, are very important to the museum for a number of reasons, but not the least of which, I usually start every tour that I give here at the museum in Manchester by pointing out the panels from Mary Orvis Marbury. These are important because they are essentially the reason the museum exists. In the 1960s, Herman Kessler, who was an art director for Field and Stream, would visit the Manchester area with his wife, Helen Shaw. They would go to the Orvis building right next door to our current campus here in Manchester. Then they were doing some research for an article on antique tackle. And Herman found in the upstairs portion of the building these panels, in addition to a couple of the fly plates used for the book Favorite Flies and Fishing with the Fly by Orvis and Cheney. So Herman thought that the panels belonged in a museum. So in 1965, he brought the idea up to the members of the Theodore Gordon Fly Fishers Club in New York City. And he floated the idea past people such as Lee Perkins, who had just recently purchased Orvis, Wes Jordan, Lee Wolf, a number of other people at that meeting. Lee didn't jump at the chance. He didn't jump on it immediately, but did give it some thought. And it didn't take too much longer before he agreed that he would be helpful in starting a museum. So what Lee did is he gave a room in the Orvis flagship store here in Manchester off of the women's apparel department. And it was a small room, and that's really where the museum got its start. The panels, of course, were featured there, and some of the other small plates. And in fact, what I'll do is I think I'll start with an interesting photograph here. And I will do that. So what you're looking at here is the Orvis shop when it was located on Union Street here in Manchester. What's interesting, of course, is the people that you see in that photograph. The tall gentleman that's inspecting a rod there is Lee Wolf. The gentleman standing behind him, behind the counters, is John Rosenkrantz. And we're not exactly sure about the woman that's seated there. It's very likely that it's Dare Wright, because the photograph dates from the late 40s, early 1950s. Of course, the Orvis shop moved to the new address on Main Street in 1956. But what's really important about this photograph, you'll notice those panels on the left-hand side of the image were displayed in the shop when it was on Union Street. So I will stop that now. So you've got an interesting photo to look at there. But as I said, the panels are very important to the museum. They really did start it up. The other thing that Mr. Kessler saw when he was rummaging around the attic area were a couple of plates. So in addition to those big panels were also these plates. And these, of course, were the panels used to show in a book of favorite flies. In addition to those were a number of panels used in Cheney and Orvis's book earlier, Fishing the Fly. And in addition, there were some panels such as these, which I think are very unusual. Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about what these are?
Yeah, so those were actually the sample flies that were used in the Orvis shop when they were tying. So you'll see a number of the little notations under each of the flies, and sometimes it'll say who created the fly, Sometimes it's from a different retailer that they took the fly from, whether it's Thomas Chubb or Thomas Conroy or John P. Moore's sons or others, because they were constantly looking for flies from all the other retailers to add to their selection. So they had the biggest selection.
And this one is a little unusual in that they utilize the space on the back of the panel also.
Right. But it's a complete alphabetical set of frames. And so there's 29 of them, I believe, and has every fly that they would have tied.
So in addition to the book that you've written on Mary Orvis Marbury and the panels, I think you've also provided a supplement that has the photographs of those plates that they use to provide photos for the book.
Yeah, so in the book, the Mary Orvis Marbury book, Mary Orvis Marbury Life in Flies that I published in August, you have all of the different frames for Mary's book and Charles's book, and all the sample frames are also there. And then I did a separate supplement specifically on the panels themselves, because they're such a historically significant thing, and no one had done a lot of research on each of the panels. So I actually went through each panel. I described each fly, each photograph, because it was a very, very significant historical thing. So that was quite an adventure in itself.
I bet. So speaking of historical adventures, you've done quite a bit of research into the panels.
Yeah, and I've also done a little research on the exposition itself. So in general terms, the exposition was in Chicago, and it began in May 1893 and closed in October 1893. It was the first U.S. World's Fair, and it was marking the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus. And it also happened to be the 300th anniversary, opened on the 300th anniversary of the birth of Isaac Walton. So that was a fortuitous thing for the fisheries building, everything fisheries related. So they had 35 million visitors who came to the fair. It was a huge success. It also was electrified by Thomas Edison. It became known as the White City because it was so unusual at the time to have electrification of the venue. And the display there, a lot of the angling display was managed by a gentleman by the name of Dr. James Alexander Henshaw. And Henshaw, in managing the angling exhibit, was a very good friend of the Orvis family. And so he had seen Favorite Flies in manuscript and had encouraged Mary to publish it, and actually had read it cover to cover and page by page. And then I think it was partly his idea to have Mary do a series of panels for the exposition. And that became just a wonderful thing for the Orvis family. As far as we know, they were not able to attend the exposition itself. And I was always wondering about that. Why didn't they not go? Well, it turns out that in May, when the exposition opened, the month it opened, Charles had been just beginning his second 4-year term as postmaster of Manchester. Mm-hmm. He had just bought the Battenkill National Bank building, which is actually still around. It's still a brick building right next to the Equinox. You can actually see it today. And he had then opened it up as the Manchester Post Office. And it's a great article in the Manchester Journal at the time announcing that we have now the most beautiful post office. And he was ready to open everything. So he was tied to the post office, couldn't leave. And then when it closed in October of 1893, his brother Franklin, we know, went with a delegation of Republicans and politicians, Vermont politicians who were mainly Republicans at the time, and some members of the press. And Charles did not go on that particular trip. He was not fond of his brother. They had different politics. Charles was a lifelong Democrat, and his brother Franklin was a lifelong Republican. So they had sort of parted ways over that. But there are 40 panels in all. They're about 3 feet by 2 feet, and they're in glass, and they are just phenomenal. They have 78 panels or plates of flies on them. There are 428 flies in these panels. So it's really kind of a time capsule, a snapshot of everything going on in angling. There are 157 photographs. The photographs are done by some of the really leading outdoor photographers at the time. These were really the top outdoor photographers that worked on this. And they were it was also, I think, an attempt by Mary to show all the different patterns, not only the ones that were Orvis specific, but from other retailers as well, to have a really comprehensive view of everything going on.
So one other question, and you and I had talked about this before. When people look at some of the programs that were written about the exposition, the fisheries building was a huge draw. But what's noticeable about the programs that were available, they never mentioned Orvis as part of the fisheries building.
Right.
And I think you and I talked about this. It's very likely that the Orvis exhibit was so important that it was part of the main attraction and the main building of the exposition.
It could very well have been, and because we can't locate it in the Anglian exhibit itself from anything that we read or that's been written about, and it was a significant thing. It was a very beautiful thing. So I think they wanted to treat it, with that kind of respect, so it's one of the real treasures, and they also within the panels they represented many of the leading fishery regions in the country. So it wasn't just Vermont. It's Vermont, New York, New Jersey, Maine, Pennsylvania, the Midwest like Wisconsin and Michigan, out west Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, California, and there are even a few panels devoted to Canada. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the panels coming up. But some of the real big fishery regions like the Adirondacks, the Yellowstone region, very important region. In Oregon, the Clackamas River region, other areas of in the Pacific Northwest, and the Maine lakes also are featured. The Rangeley Lake region was in Aquasic, and that whole area was a very important region at the time too. So it is a time capsule. It represents the leading fisheries. If you walk through it, it basically is a great sort of mini museum about every fly in every significant area with beautiful photography. Has many of the leading anglers of the time are included there with their flies. And we've also learned a lot about Mary's ability to just collaborate with lots of different people to put this together. There were a lot of authors involved, other leading anglers. They had tremendous ability to just work with lots of different people, some very, very famous people, and great, and others that were just great fishermen, and sent in their suggestions for flies, for favorite flies, which she had just written, which has 500 patterns in it.
Sure.
And but it became, all in all, just a huge win for them promotionally. And you'll see in each of the panels as we go through the panels, you'll see that the Orvis Superfine Flies logo is actually on every panel, very discreetly, beautifully, elegantly displayed. So they're very good at promotion. So maybe let's take a look at some of the panels.
Sure, and I think it's important to note too that the book Favorite Flies from Mary Orvis Marbury was published in 1892, just 1 year before the exposition. So this would have been a wonderful opportunity for the Orvis family to promote not only the book, but their flies as well.
Absolutely.
And we also talk often about the fact that Mary, by compiling all of the recipes, if you will, for these flies, is really the first to standardize some of the patterns.
Yeah, and they were before then, many of the fly patterns were numbered. So every vendor had a numbering system, and they were trying to lock you into kind of their catalog. And they felt strongly, Orvis felt strongly, that they should be named patterns and they should be shared across lots of different vendors. So you could have a standard, Coachman, Royal Coachman, or Parmachine Belle, whatever you wanted to buy. And there were lots of conflicts in the names, and we'll go through a little bit as we go through the panels. And there was a lot of controversy about who actually developed this particular pattern, and who designed it originally, who tied it for the first time. Many of the flies that were tied, for the panels were actually tied and designed by Charles, her father. So he became a big part of the whole operation for flies as well. And without him, it would have been difficult to do. But they're wonderful. And so I think if we start with the first panel.
Sure. So let's go ahead and bring up that.
Yeah. And it's sort of fitting that the first panel actually is the only panel that really features Mary. And so on the left-hand side in the corner, you'll see at the bottom, you'll see Mary tying by a window in the Orvis tying shop. And on the right-hand side, There are 6 of her tyers are featured, and it just says a group from the fly room. And it's an early photo with very young tyers. You'll see these are very young women. And I sort of identified 2 of them are her sisters-in-law. So
Let's
that
see if
was
I
very much
can't
yeah, very much.
zoom in a little
Oh,
bit
good. Okay.
here.
Yeah, on the right-hand side on the bottom.
There we
Okay.
go.
Yeah. And so 2 of them were her sister-in-law, so Mina Simpson and Annie Graves rather. But 2 of them are sisters. In the middle, you can see the 2 girls in the middle are young women in the middle are actually sisters. There were actually 3 sets of sisters who worked for Mary. And we know that from some of the documentation that we found. And there were 2 sets of 2 sisters and 1 set of 3 sisters.
Wow.
And they were all these women were local women. They were trained to tie the flies by Mary, and they became very proficient. They were doing lots of handicrafts and other kinds of things that required a lot of skill. They were collectively known as the Owls. And we still don't know why they were called the Owls. We think it may have been in part because that they had to start doing some of their work initially at night when they had didn't have other chores. And that's may have been why they were called the Owls. And some of the cabinet photographs, you'll actually see a little cutout paper owl in 2 of the cabinet photographs that are in the book of the tyers. But this is a very interesting panel also because in the middle, there's actually in the bottom middle, there's a shot of the resting place in the fly room. So there was a sense, I think, that you could work very hard, but then maybe you could rest a little bit too. And so it was, I think Mary created an environment where it was, comfortable to work. This was very hard work, required a lot of concentration. So there was a notion of this basically says the resting, it's the resting part of the room. And then on the very top, there's a very interesting photograph. And this is from William Cassard's den. And William Cassard was a leading collector at the time of tackle, so rods and reels and flies. He designed a large number of flies. In fact, there's a Cassard fly itself has 3 different variations. And he designed something called the Matador and many other flies as well. Very, very good. I think he was an author and also did some art as well, photography. A number of his photographs are in the panels. Certainly very, very talented guy. And you'll find actually if you zoom in a little bit on that, those frames are actually quite interesting on the top there. Those are actually on the left-hand side, those 2, there's a leaping trout and a leaping bass. Those are Wakeman Holberton prints that are quite important and interesting in themselves. He was an illustrator, also a retailer. He actually retailed Sarah McBride's flies. Sarah McBride was a very famous early tyer who tied flies in Mumford, New York with her father right before the Orvises did in the 1870s.
And if you don't mind, we'll touch really quick on the McBrides. So the McBrides were actually participants in an earlier show, which you think may have had some influence on Charles and Mary's decision to exhibit at the exposition.
Yeah, I think Sarah McBride. We know from the archives at the Smithsonian that Sarah McBride provided a display of salmon, trout, and bass flies for the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, and that is a very well-known exposition. It also happens to be the exposition where Charles Orvis won a major award for his reel, the 1874 patent Orvis reel, which was a real innovation at the time. One of the first modern, really so-called modern fly reels.
Sure.
And so I think it was not lost on him that there was a fly display by a woman who worked for her father tying flies. And so maybe when the exposition in Chicago came around, they may have had an idea to do something similar. There are 2 notable flies on this panel. Just to mention them quickly, in the very middle, there's a green fly on the right-hand side called the green and gold, and there's a black and gold one on the left. Those were actually patterns that Charles Orvis designed himself personally, and the green and gold actually appears on a very famous 4-color trade card that they produced with Milton Bradley. And all the prints in her book and her father's book were done by Milton Bradley. Very early examples of great chromolithic printing in America.
Sure. And that is the same Milton Bradley that we're familiar with, the same company right
yes,
there.
the game
The game company,
and
sure.
everything. Yeah. So
Sure.
let's go on to panel 2.
Okay.
This is another panel that's fairly close to home. These are photos of the Indawa, and that was the Native American name for the Battenkill River. And so these sort of have pride of placement, being the second panel. The photos were by J.D. Way. And J.D. Way, his wife, the former Belle Goodenough, Goodenough, was one of the tyers who worked with Mary. And he also photographed Mary in a cabinet card that we have in my book. So we know that he knew Mary very well. Scenes are famous stretches of the river. So there's one called Hard's Ripples, the Pent Bridge, and one titled When the Trout Rise, and another one, Where You Lunch. So these were important places. The flies include one named after the Indawa, and that's the best fly on the left. Quite a beautiful fly. And also there are a variety of American and British patterns on the panel that would have been used on the Battenkill. There's one called the Marston's Fancy, and that was named after R.B. Marston. He was the founder of the British edition of the Fishing Gazette, which was a very important newspaper in England. The Orvis family had tremendous relationships with the press. They thought that it was very important to know everyone in the press and all the editors. In fact, they sent a display of flies to Forest and Stream to kind of butter up the editors. But R.B. Marston was always saying nice things about Mary and nice things about the Orvises. And so the other thing in here, there's a grasshopper pattern at the bottom right, on the very bottom there. And you'll notice that it doesn't look much like a grasshopper. It's quite a beautiful fly, but it doesn't look much like a grasshopper. It's a beautiful pattern. It was very much disparaged by people like Lewis Reed, who tied very kind of imitative patterns of grasshoppers, and even people like Theodore Gordon wrote about this fly and said it doesn't look anything like a grasshopper, as an example of, these are not meant to imitate. These are really kind of beautiful flies that are intended in part to catch fishermen as much as to catch fish.
Which is something that's still true today.
Yes, absolutely.
The goal is to catch the fishermen. That's right.
And then there are other British patterns on this panel, include the blue bottle, which actually imitated the common housefly. It's actually a bluish fly, looks sort of like a housefly. The chantry and the pale evening dun, which was an Alfred Ronalds pattern. Alfred Ronalds, a very famous tyer and entomologist from England. And that's the pale evening dun. And then the gray drake is also a British pattern. So if we go on to panel 4.
Okay.
I want to get through as many of the panels as I can and, to show you a little bit but it's just a taste. And we're only going to get to 11 panels. There's 40 of them. So you got to come to the museum and see them all.
Absolutely.
Here and study them in more detail. But panel 4 is now we're out west. These are in the middle. If you zoom in maybe on the middle,
of course.
There's a very unusual photograph of a fish pot. So the fish pot was actually a thermal geyser basin on the shore of Yellowstone, in the West Thumb Geyser Basin, and you could actually catch a cutthroat trout, and you could swing it into the geyser, and you could cook it. And this was a favorite thing that people like to do, and it became a quite important image that was sent in postcards around the country, around the world. And there was some controversy about whether that actually cooked the fish well enough for you to eat it, but that's another story. Jackson is the photographer, W.H. Jackson, very famous photographer. He was commissioned to complete the first commission government survey of Yellowstone and the Rocky Mountains. Very important person, and that was in 1870. And the Yellowstone was then made the first national park, partly because of the photographs that he had shared with everyone about how beautiful this place was. He was one of the official photographers for the world's Columbian Exposition as well. Originally was from Vermont and then went west. And he photographed many Native Americans. He was very well known. His collection of Native American photography is very well known. He sold his entire collection of photographs to the Detroit Publishing Company, which became one of the largest publishers of photochrome processed postcards.
Okay.
And they had 40,000 images, 7 million postcards were sold annually from them. And then Mount Jackson in Yellowstone was named after Mr. Jackson. And there's a jewel fly, which is featured here. Some confusion about this fly. Some said it was Thaddeus Norris, who was a very famous early fisherman in America, had developed it. Another person had said, well, a gentleman who had known John Shields, who was another fly tyer from Brookline, Massachusetts, had developed it. And Mary sort of humorously said in her book, who can decide when doctors disagree? And that
Okay.
was sort of the
Very
way she put it.
diplomatic.
Very
Right.
diplomatic. She was quite diplomatic. So if we go on to panel 6, and these are from the Adirondacks. So there are a tremendous number of panels and flies and photographs from the Adirondacks. Seneca R. Stoddard was the premier photographer at the time in the Adirondacks, very well known in upstate New York. His photographs helped drive the movement to preserve the Adirondack Park, which was approved by an act of the state of New York in 1892. Fortuitously, he was a pioneer in nighttime flash photography using magnesium metal powder, which was highly flammable and dangerous. So it's a miracle that it didn't burn up the entire Adirondack Park. He photographed many nighttime campfire scenes. He's well known for that in the Adirondacks. And these photographs are from 3 different Adirondack lakes: the Blue Mountain Lake, the Shadowgate Lake, and the Raquette Lake. And the flies are 3 very fancy Orvis flies, what we call lake flies. One of the really beautiful parts of the sort of the art of Mary and her fly tying are these beautiful lake flies. And many of them are in her book. These were specifically designed for this popular region. One could say that they actually even designed these patterns to kind of market themselves in the Adirondacks by calling one the Adirondack. And they're brighter. And Mary also said these are sort of somewhat brighter colored than one would select for the more thickly inhabited regions. Sort of a nice way of saying, well, this is such a beautiful wild area. If you throw these flies at, fish who have never seen a fly before, they'll probably be interested in it. So she had the Shadowgay was also a favorite fly of George Bethune. He was a famous preacher and publisher. He was the first to publish Isaac Walton's Complete Angler in America in 1847. And the Raquette was named after the lake. It was designed actually by Charles Orvis.
And it's also, I think, worth noting that the tyers that Mary employed did all these flies by hand. They did not use a vise.
Yeah, they were tying in the hand, which was sort of the way that people were tying then. They didn't use vices. Later on, they would use vices, but these women all tied in the hand.
Which I think, given how beautiful these flies are and how well executed the job was, just remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable. So.
It's no wonder they needed a resting room in
a lot of work. Well, they tied thousands and thousands of flies, hundreds and hundreds of patterns. Just quite remarkable. So panel 13, the next one is the only one with all salmon flies. So this is one dedicated entirely to Atlantic salmon flies. And the painting in the middle is called Steady Johnny Steady. And I think she calls it Steady Jock Steady, but the official title is Steady Johnny Steady. And that's a famous salmon fishing painting by Erskine Nicol from Scotland. The 4 images around the flies are actually from an American artist whose name is Walter Brackett, and they were exhibited at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. And then they were subsequently sold at auction to a British acquirer, and they disappeared into England for many, many years. And the Field publication, through a series of letters, actually located these for the original family of the artist so that they could reacquire them. And it's a very famous story. It ended up being like 3 or 4 different letters over many, many months that put together a story where these actually ended up. But they're quite beautiful in different stages of, fighting the salmon. They're mainly British patterns, like the Blue Doctor, the Dusty Miller, Durham Ranger. Durham Ranger was invented by James Wright of Kelso in Scotland. Durham Ranger has this golden pheasant crest on the top of it, quite distinctive. And there was actually an entire underwater study by H.P. Wells to determine how the salmon view this particular fly and this particular golden pheasant crest in the water. Because the theory was it had this luminous quality, and then you always wanted golden pheasant crest on your salmon fly.
Sure.
And so they did a lot of extensive research on that. And if you think this actually settled anything about why salmon take flies, you probably not met a lot of salmon fishermen because they have no idea to this day why the salmon actually take their flies. But it was quite an interesting experiment. Other British patterns in the panel include the ghost, the silver gray, the thunder and lightning. The black dose, the Scottish inver green, and the very colorful harlequin. These are all quite famous British patterns. And Mary and her tyers undoubtedly learned to tie these patterns from the Scotsman John Haley. And John Haley was brought up to Manchester by Charles to teach both he and his daughter to tie flies.
And he was from New York City.
He was from New York City, and he did teach people how to tie flies. He was well known for doing that. But he also tied a lot of flies and sold a lot of flies. He's very famous for being the creator of a very, very well-known fly. And there's an extraordinary story in Favorite Flies about this fly. And there was a British fly called the Coachman, and that has this beautiful peacock curl, green peacock curl on it, and some wings. They're white or they're gray, depending on the pattern. And the problem with that fly is that Haley was tying these flies and sending them up to the fishermen in the Catskills, and they would get torn apart by the brook trout, who just tore apart this peacock body very quickly. So some of his fishermen were saying, please, give us something more durable. So he tied a version of that Coachman with red silk in the middle.
Okay.
And sent it up to the Orvises, sent a set of these up to the Orvises to look at. And they were sitting on the veranda, I guess, at the Equinox house here in Manchester. And her uncle, Levi Church Orvis, was talking to them. And they were talking about the whole issue of naming flies, and used this John Haley fly as an example. So, for instance, John Haley's just sent us this fly, and it looks like a Coachman, but it has the red silk on it. It's more of a Royal Coachman, and that's actually how the Royal Coachman fly was named.
That's very cool.
So there are other thing in here. There's a Kennedy pattern, which is the only sort of American design pattern. That was actually designed by an American, John S. Kennedy, from New York City. He sent some perfect wild turkey feathers to Forrest & Sons, famous tyer and retailer in Kelso, Scotland, who then tied the pattern for him.
Okay.
So, and finding specific materials was always, beautiful materials was always a challenge.
Sure.
So, now the next panel, panel 15, is in Florida. So he's the only one from Florida, really, they had the Charles Otis family had a small hotel near Sarasota, which was called the Palms, and they would put people up there during the winter and have them fish in the local area in the St. John River and other areas of Florida. It was operated by Mary's brother, Robert. There's some famous stories about Mary going and actually fishing with her brother, Robert. It's one of the few times we can document that she actually went fishing. But she went, and she was quite perturbed one day when her brother refused to provide her tackle for the day. And so she adopted a very large hand line and threw a large piece of bait out and caught a very large shark. And the shark was so large, she had to have one of the local guys help her bring it in as well. It was just a huge fish, evidently, and she was quite excited about that development. And reported it in her own letter and article to Forest and Stream newspaper. But these photos are of the St. John River, and panel includes the only a fly called the cracker, which I think is up here it's on the right-hand side there.
Okay.
On the top. And the cracker, sort of a derogatory term now, but it was a term that was used routinely for poor whites in Florida, and it was developed by Dr. George Trowbridge of New York City. Only saltwater fly in the panels. and it was used for saltwater for redfish and sea trout and even tarpon.
Mhm.
And other patterns on this panel are really kind of bass flies that were including the Beaufort moth, the fiery dragon, and the golden dustman. According to James Alexander Henshaw, he had some success fishing for coastal species in Florida with the golden dustman, which is actually a bass fly.
That had to be quite challenging because the flies may have attracted fish like a tarpon,
Yeah.
but the tackle really wasn't up to speed at that time. I mean, we're
No,
talking
Yeah.
1893, 1894.
Yeah.
They didn't have the benefit of Seamaster reels or
No.
Findor wedding cakes that could
No. And it
withstand
was
that.
unusual for them to be fishing for tarpon with flies. So these were mostly, at my sense, mostly inland waterway, small tarpon, baby
Sure,
tarpon,
sure.
sort of like, little guys that they were playing around with, but
Yeah.
mainly redfish and sea.
Still very exciting. And a
very
tarpon is a
exciting.
tarpon. They're great fun.
And so the next panel, panel 18, is actually from California. These are all from California, taken by I.W. Tabor of San Francisco, famous photography from there. Includes the 3,300-foot high El Capitan in the background in Yosemite, the Merced River, Mirror Lake in Yosemite, and the falls in the Yosemite Valley. The Californian pattern in the center of the fly was aptly named and was actually designed by Charles for a Californian customer. So he sort of branded this, oh, you want a California fly? Great, here's a California fly.
Quite the marketing genius,
Yeah,
wasn't
he was.
He missed an opportunity.
They very often designed patterns based on what customers wanted or were looking for, and they would market them for specific regions or with specific names, that kind of thing. What's very unusual about the rest of these flies, though, on this panel is that they are actually made with fish scales for wings. This is a very distinctive style of fly. They're also made with a huge variety of materials. So the body materials, there are actually 5 different body materials used: rubber, wool, chenille, cork, and straw. And I believe these flies were probably the work of John Harrington Keene. And he was well known. He was a crazy British guy who came to Manchester to live with his wife. And he actually was the only male who was known to have tied with Mary.
Mm-hmm.
He was listed on the official list of people who tied with her. Probably tied with her for a couple years, possibly. I think he taught Mary and Charles a great deal about British fishing. He was actually the son of the royal fisherman at Windsor Park. So his father was the royal fisherman for Queen Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
So he fished with Francis and Reverend Manley and all these very famous fishermen. So he grew up with these people. John became a fisherman on the Thames, being a guide for fishing on the Thames with many people. And then he produced an incredible number of wonderful books about fly tying and fly fishing, and started writing in his 20s, articles and then books. Very, very accomplished author. But he was somewhat controversial. The scale wing flies really didn't work out terribly well. They were actually put in the Orvis catalog for a while. They did not sell well, evidently. And there was a local rumor that he took a little bit too much of an interest in Mary, and Charles got very cross with him or had some kind of a falling out with him, either over some commercial issue or over his interest in Mary. And he decamped to upstate New York with his wife shortly thereafter in Greenwich, and started his own fly tying operation. And he and his wife, Anna, tied flies for the rest of their lives. And she actually tied flies for 30 years after his death. But very interesting character. He was very interested in showing people how to tie flies.
Sure.
And so one of the first real books about fly tying was called Fly Fishing and Fly Tying by John Harrington Keene. And that was in the 1880s that he published that book. And the Orvises were not at all interested in teaching people how to tie flies. They wanted them to buy flies from Orvis. And so they were not that interested in that. And that may have been another source of tension. But he was, and he had lots of opinions. And people at the time didn't necessarily want to listen to an Englishman who had opinions about how they should fish.
Yeah, that was something that, and I agree with you there. Two things. His books are fantastic. The original versions of fly fishing, fly tying, featured pages with material.
Yeah, he actually had
Attached to the
material
pages. Which,
tipped into the
yeah,
pages. So if you get an original, if you're fortunate enough to have an original edition with all the materials still in place, it's a beautiful thing.
it is.
And obviously very labor intensive to make, an expensive book to make.
Sure.
And but somewhat reminiscent of the covers of the Orvis books as well, beautifully in, with gilt covers and gilt illustrations, and very well done.
Now, the other thing that you had just mentioned, that of course the Orvises weren't necessarily interested in teaching people how to tie their own, because of course their business was supplying flies.
Yeah.
This might be a good time to mention something that you and I talked about earlier about the way that Charles used to fish.
Right. Yeah, he was in his own book, he only, the Charles Orvis Fishing with a Fly that he co-authored with Albert Nelson Cheney, he only supplied one chapter. And that was sort of typical of Charles. He signed up all his friends to write chapters, and they were all well known and wrote some wonderful things for him. And his chapter was humbly called Suggestions. And one of the things that he suggested was, he said, well, when I fish, I fish with at least 3 or 4 flies at a time, and he would gang them together. So you see these snelled leaders were designed so you could put 3 or 4 flies on a longer leader and fish them together. Because he said, well, you never know which one is going to be appealing to the fish. So he was out there, saying, buy 3 or 4 at a time. And of course, buy many so that you don't have to resupply in the wild. They would say things like that, and constantly. And so, but they sold thousands and thousands of flies, and over the years, I think it was, he was the postmaster, so he knew a lot about mail order and how to started selling rods and then reels and flies. And so they sold thousands of flies with the mail all over the country. And it was a really, really profitable part of their business.
And this may be a good time to interject another question for you. So as postmaster and someone that was involved early on with the mail order business, did Charles include a questionnaire when he would send out some of these orders to his customers, asking them about their choice of fly for their region?
Yeah, and so that's how the whole project around favorite flies, Mary's book, came together, is that he had this idea to send out questionnaires to each of his customers and ask them, what are your favorite flies? Who designed them? Who invented them? How are they fished? Where are they fished? So it was this treasure trove of information that came back, and the hundreds of correspondents from around the country kind of in great detail told him exactly what flies they used and what they were called and who invented them. And that became the grist for the mill that became favorite flies. And that's what made it so popular, is that they had literally the best collection of information about those. And then once they had sort of said, this is what a Denison looks like, well, that were the standard, right? So it's in the book. Look, that's what the Denison looks like. So if you, God forbid, if you should try to sell a Denison that didn't look like their version, and people wanted the original bespoke, original flies, in the original patterns. And so they were kind of then anointed as, well, they know more about flies than anyone. And so therefore I should buy my flies from them. So in the next panel, panel 19, that's a spectacular photograph of the Osable Gap, chasm rather, or the gap in New York State, again by Stoddard, with 3 spectacular flies. I mean, those flies are some of the most beautiful in all the displays. And here, my feeling is that Mary was kind of really showing off. I mean, really just, she may have tied these herself. They're so beautiful and rare. All 3 of these patterns don't appear in her book or in her father's book.
Interesting.
They are in the sample frames. So she definitely tied them. But I think they were tied in this very large size for this exposition, and to really kind of show off what they could do. They're also named in a very strange way. The Adonis was actually designed by William Cassard, who was a good friend of theirs. And that's the one in the middle with the big peacock feather eye on it, on the wing. And he was well known, had a lot of different patterns that he tied. He has 3 versions of the Cassard, for instance. And then the other 2 were, the naming was sort of reported by a gentleman by the name of Henry Guy Carleton. And he was a famous author and a playwright and a humorist. And he wrote a famous book about fishing for William Mills that was for young people, teaching them how to fish, but evidently it's very humorous. had a great sense of humor, and they actually mention she mentions in her book the William Mills Company, which was a direct competitor to Orvis, in connection with the book from Henry Carleton. I suspect that that she met him at some point, because he recounted the name of these other flies. The thistle on the left, and the volunteer on the right were reportedly named by after two yachts of whose names were involved in a famous race. And that's the only kind of background we have on those flies and how they were named. But these clearly were very large and gaudy flies designed to catch fishermen as much as fish. And just a beautiful part of the
Well, they
display.
certainly are beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
And that photo is just spectacular.
Yeah, it's great. It's one of the greats.
It's one of the greats. It's not my favorite from the
No.
panels, but I
Yeah.
do believe that we're going to get to that.
We're going to get to that one, absolutely. So, and panel 25 is on the Nipigon River. The Nipigon River is a very, very specific place. It's in Thunder Bay area, region in northwestern Ontario. Very good example of a trophy fishery, which the Orvises like to promote trophy fisheries where you can catch lots of large fish. And so they were, throughout the panels, you'll see large groups of bass, groups of salmon, groups of trout from very, very well-known fisheries. And so this was part of their branding, is that, our flies catch you these large fish, and that's by extension. The Nipigon holds the world record for brook trout. And to this day, it was a 14.5-pound beast, and it was caught there. And the top photo actually in this panel features 16 brook trout from the Nipigon, weighing a total of 55 pounds. That's 55 pounds of brook trout right there. So, and there are
Not
many.
much for catch and release, I suppose. But
No, it was very much the style to have these huge trophy photographs. I mean, you might have 100 brook trout, or, and that was kind of the style. As much as you could kill and display was, the style at the time. And then there are many other interesting photos here. There's a photo of the Cane River, the Gunn Brothers camp, showing some trout, and actually on the bottom there, that photograph on the bottom, you can see a very large bearskin by the water.
Oh, there we go.
It's a very large bearskin. And so that's sort of an interesting photo from the Nipigon. The flies include a Claire Montreal, sort of nominally a Canadian named fly. The Allerton there was named after Robert G. Allerton. He was the treasurer of the Aquasic Angling Association, very famous club up in the Rangeley Lakes region.
Sure.
And he was the author of the famous book about brook trout fishing called Brook Trout Fishing, published in 1869, that has a beautiful chromolithic print of a brook trout in it, probably the best print of a brook trout in a book. It's a very collectible book. There's another fly in here called the Quack Doctor, which she was not able to determine the origin of the pattern and why it was named. And the only thing I can think of is that they knew a lot of doctors. And maybe
they didn't have a very high opinion of that one, if they call them a quack.
Either way. So, there's a Marston in here, which is actually the bass version of the Marston. And that's again named after the editor of the British Fishing Gazette. He was a very famous guy. The Francis fly is named after the famous British author Francis Francis. And the Matador fly was actually designed by William Cassard. There's also a very unusual blue fly at the bottom there on the left.
Yeah.
And that is the Brazilian blue wing, and quite a rare fly. Mary said that the blue color was very rarely used in the wing, and but she said that it sometimes worked on obstinate trout.
Okay.
So I guess it was unusual enough that it caught their eye.
It certainly is unusual. You don't see that color very
Yes,
often.
absolutely. So then on panel 29, this is one of the favorites. And so it's not only a beautiful setting, but it's quite unusual in that there are 3 women fishing in this photograph. And you'll notice throughout the panels, I kind of knew there were a number of women featured fishing in the panels. And I actually went and counted them all up, and I was surprised at how many actually. There are actually 26 women featured in the panels.
In the 40 panels,
In the
26
40,
panels.
there are 26 women, and sometimes in background, sometimes they're the primary fisherman or fisher in the fly fisher in the shot. So there's so this one has three women. They're fishing in the majestic Wagon Wheel Gap, which is on the Upper Rio Grande in Colorado. That area became a very famous springs resort. So when people would go and take the springs and the waters, they would go there. Very famous number of presidents went out there. The flies in the panel are all trout flies. There's one that has actually named after, has a number. See if I can find it. I think it may be, is it on the left here? Number 68, might be the first one on the left. Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, so that's called number 68. And that's the only numbered fly in the panels.
Okay.
But it harkens back to the day when there were no standard patterns and they were numbered.
Sure.
They were actually numbering flies themselves.
Okay.
So they started naming them. And then till the standards were adopted. And then there's something called the Lady Martha and the Lady Sue. They were named by an Orvis customer. And he was Benjamin Allen of Nashville, Tennessee. And don't know whether those were people that he knew or part of his family, but definitely a number of flies were named by their customers. And the Grayman, the gray hackle, the claret, the soldier, which is sometimes called the soldier gnat, the green drake, the olive dun, the whimbrel, and the wasp are all English patterns and famous ones. And the wasp was actually one of the oldest patterns from England. It actually had been tied and featured by the nun, Dame Juliana Berners, who was credited with writing one of the first, she's purported to have written one of the first texts about angling ever I think it would be the 1400s, very early, earliest books in fishing history. And the wasp was one of the patterns that she featured. The raven was a bass fly from La Crosse, Wisconsin. And the Maurice actually is a good example of a fly that was named after Mr. Fitzmaurice, who was the manager of the fishing department at the John P. Moore's Sons shop in New York City. And he was a very well-known person.
Sure.
And so they were always currying favor with they were very smart. They were currying favor with the people who retailed flies, people who retailed gear. So you may have heard of the Prouty fly. It was named after Lorenzo Prouty, who was the fishing manager at Bradford and Anthony in Boston, very famous retailer. And this one was named after Mr. Fitzmaurice. And the Grizzly Dutchman here may have been named after Dutchman's Hole on the Beaverkill in the Catskills. There's surprisingly few. One of the things I found actually was there were actually surprisingly few scenes from the Catskills in this set of panels. And I think there was a healthy competition at the time, even between Vermont and New York on fishing. And they knew the Catskills were important, and they definitely featured them on 3 or 4 different panels, but in a very minor role. Nobody, and they didn't feature a lot of famous people from there or others. And while we now know that she was actually featured in a photograph with Theodore Gordon, that was not featured here. And
right.
Was not. They definitely knew a lot of people in the Catskills.
And that's a photograph that you have in your book.
Yes.
Which is a very famous image that for years and years, it was talked about that Theodore Gordon was with a quote unquote girlfriend.
Yes.
Or female acquaintance. But I think you mentioned that you would talk to Mr. Van Putt.
Van Putt, who was a very famous historian and author in the Catskills. And he told me definitively that this was Mary. And then I was able to produce a comparison side by side with a profile from a cabinet card from Mary. And you can see same nose, same ears.
And that's in your book also.
Same hairdo, same chin. Yeah, so it really kind of matched up, right?
Sure.
So we were able to identify that. So in the final panel, there's again photographs by S.R. Stoddard of Lake George. Includes a photo of Recluse Island. And Recluse Island was sort of interesting because there was a prank, and it was reported by telegraph that the island had been struck by an earthquake and had descended 85 feet. And it was telegraphed. It ended up appearing as a news item in 5,000 newspapers before everybody figured out it was a hoax. And somebody just put this out there. So the fake news. Um, there are
I guess, yeah.
and there are two very large bass in there in the middle that were caught by Albert Nelson Cheney. And so these are very quite large fish.
The co-author of
Fishing with the Fly in 1883. And there are two different Lake George patterns. And then the Marston fly is there again. And the Cheney bass fly is on the right as well, sort of in the middle. That's quite a beautiful fly. And that's named after Cheney. And he's actually a relative of Dick Cheney's. They were related through their family. And he was kind of a very important fisheries commissioner in New York and important person. And obviously that's the co-author of Charles's book, very important to him. And he knew a large number of people, very important fishermen around the country. I think it was very helpful to Charles and to Mary. So I'll leave you with one last story, which tells you a little bit about, and it's about the Cleveland fly, which is on the bottom, I think, on the right-hand panel there, the right-hand side, other side.
My other right.
Bottom, yeah.
There you go.
And that's the Cleveland fly, which is sort of a monstrosity in some ways, kind of beautiful in its own way, kind of overdone and overdressed. Partly because there's a great story about this gentleman whose last name was Cleveland. He was the treasurer of a jolly group of anglers who fished together called the Texas Club. And Mary relates this conversation that she had with the treasurer after she had tied the Cheney fly and tied her first attempt at a Cleveland fly. And so he said, and she quotes him, she says, "I have wanted to meet you for a long time. I have a question for you. Now, honestly, don't you think you put a little more color into the Cheney fly than you did into the Cleveland? Now answer me frankly." And so it just says, maker, "I did not intend to do so, I assure you." And then the treasurer, "Well, but I think you did. Couldn't it be dressed up a trifle some way?" Maker, "I'm glad you spoke to me about it. I would be pleased to try again and make a fly more worthy the name." Treasurer, "Yes, do. And mind you, a little more gilt on it than the Cheneys." So this new Cleveland fly is an earnest endeavor to construct the fly, the embodiment of strength, modesty, brilliance, and other sterling merits, traits that win and hold the friends of Mr. William D. Cleveland outside as well as within the Texas Club. So I think the Cleveland fly proved once again how adept that Mary was at her business of making flies and at the same time dealing with so many overblown male egos at the time.
That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. That's quite a description. I think I'd have a tendency to want to buy something with a description like that.
Right.
Well, so all of these, of course, and by the way, I think this is a good opportunity to give a shout out to Jonathan Barkin, the photographer that I worked with here at the museum to get some of the photos.
So John was the designer, lead designer on the book, and lead project manager on the production book. He's worked with me on 2 books now, Fly Fishing Treasures and then this book. He's tremendously talented, and with Calvin LeBranch and Yuli Meckler was the designer of the cover and all the and basically the typography and everything. He's a wonderful guy too. But John came in and he had the unenviable task of working with you well, not to say that was like, but when you took all those panels off the wall here and then shooting them without getting any of the glare from the glass. These are double-sided glass framed, and you'll see over there. I mean, they're quite.
Let's see if I can get that.
We can show people what it looks like.
Get that photo up here.
Yeah, we'll show you. So
there we are.
So as you walk into the museum directly on your left, you can basically see all of the panels there, and they're just one of the real treasures of fly fishing, and encourage everyone to come to the museum and see them.
Yeah, so we just touched on just a few of the panels.
Yeah, there are 40 of them, and we only talked about 11.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's really a tremendous asset for the museum to have them here. They're on display, as Steve pointed out, as soon as you walk in the building. It is the artifact that I lead the tours with because they're that important. They're that beautiful. The flies are just amazing. Their color, the talent that went into tying them, the photographs. This was no small feat. So the Orvises clearly spent a real amount of time putting this together. And it is it must have been somewhat nerve-wracking for them knowing that they were shipping this thing off to the Chicago area without being in attendance themselves. But I think, again, you and I talked about this earlier. It's very likely they had a very good working relationship with Dr. Henshaw.
Yeah, and Dr. Henshaw was the top guy in the angling exhibit. And so he was a very important person. And so I think he shepherded everything through the process. And in fact, this display was not unlike a number of displays in other parts of the different pavilions. And so I think he sort of spec'd the display with them, and then I think made sure it was displayed properly. And so they could count on this, being treated properly. And then it ended up back in the shop.
Yeah, so it had to come back from Chicago in one piece also. So
back in the shop, and there's a great description of somebody walking around, in an old description of somebody walking around the old shop, even before the photograph that you have, describing these panels being in place, and they always had a great place in their shop.
Yeah, no, they're pretty historic. So certainly we welcome everyone to come and visit us here in Manchester, Vermont, so that you can see these panels in person. And if you can, in the meantime, of course, there's this wonderful book written by Steve. Certainly, I encourage you to purchase the book. Steve, why don't you give out your website?
It's just flyfishingtreasures.com. And so you get both this book and then the supplement, which goes through each of the panels and every fly and every photograph in each of the panels and all 40 panels. So that comes with it. So
we do have a couple of copies of the book here in our shop here in Manchester, Vermont. So if you're here to see the panels and you want to purchase a copy of the book, you can do that right here in Manchester, Vermont. So with that, again, I'd like to thank all of our visitors from midcurrent.com. This was, in fact, our #1 artifact here at the museum. We were very happy to put that series together. If you have an opportunity, you can go to midcurrent.com and take a look at the top 50 items, going all the way back to number 50, of course. And then, Steve, I can't thank you enough for coming in today to talk about them. Congratulations on the book. It's fantastic. The photography.
We could not have done this without the museum and without you, specifically without you.
No, I'm a very small part. It's just an amazing history. It's incredibly well written. As you can tell, just from what we've covered today, we've kind of just skimmed over the top, really.
Yeah, we've only touched the surface.
So again, I encourage you to get a copy of the book, encourage you to come to the museum. And if you're not a member of the museum, certainly encourage you to join. Your membership will get you admission, of course, to the Manchester, Vermont Museum, but it also helps support programs like this webinar and this edition of Tackle Talk, which, by the way, will be available for viewing in a couple of days. We'll have it archived up on our website, amff.org, where conveniently you can also become a member if you're not already. All right, everyone, thank you very much. Steve, again, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.